And now for a CBS News special report, let's go to Dan Rather in New York.
And from CBS News World Headquarters in New York, we take you directly live to Baghdad. The fiercest anti-aircraft fire of the day. Obviously, the Iraqis believe that an attack is underway. Attacks have been in the far distance for about the last 30 to 45 minutes. An official in Washington has said there's obviously a big hit and another. We're seeing this today from multiple cameras in various places around Baghdad. And we also have some satellite photographs of the city in general, which we may show you later. By far the heaviest attacks on Baghdad yet. This is the third series of attacks, no question. This is the heaviest yet. As a fireball rises. The story of this hour, the biggest rage yet being rained on Baghdad. Escalation of the aerial campaign is obvious, but it may not be as intense as originally planned, because U.S. officials are known to be in surrender talks with senior Iraqi authorities. And these deeds of carnage could be read as one way of trying to move those negotiations along. We're letting this play, the sounds and sights, because in many important ways the picture and the sound speak for themselves. U.S. officials have been saying that America's commanding General Tommy Franks would, quote, scale the intensity of the bombardment in accordance with progress in the surrender talks. Taking that literally, it would say that the surrender talks have not been going particularly well in recent hours, and there is the fact that U.S. forces in the field have met some strong resistance in the last 12, 15 hours. Cruise missiles, some of them air-launched, can be reasonably assumed to have had a part in this. Tomahawk cruise missiles fired from the sea can also reasonably be deduced as involved in a raid of this magnitude. And while we do not know so for a fact, B-52s took off this morning. They may or may not be involved in this. B-52s carry so-called smart bombs, laser-guided bombs, as well as some others. And then there's the F-17 stealth bomber, which operates almost exclusively at night and was involved in the previous two attacks on Baghdad. And as the hands of the Sisters of Death and Night move incessantly over Baghdad, we bring in CBS News national security correspondent David Martin from the Pentagon. David, this is unquestionably and by far the biggest in the now 3 series of raids on Baghdad.
Dan, this is the much advertised shock and awe, the campaign that is supposed to not so much destroy Iraq as to destroy the will of Iraq's leaders to resist. And this is really a moment of truth for the Iraqi leadership, because what the U.S. is saying here is this is what's going to happen if you don't surrender. And we've been watching this, for 5 or 10 minutes. The U.S. has the capability to keep this up around the clock, and I'm sure that is exactly what is being said in these surrender talks. Notice how the lights are still on in this picture. These strikes are not the normal type of strikes that you conduct when you're trying to take down a society's center of gravity so that it can no longer fight. These strikes are going after leadership posts in an attempt to convince the leadership that they just have no other choice but to give in. It's sort of saying, you thought Saddam Hussein was bad, we can be worse. Whose side are you on?
It's just after 9 p.m. Baghdad time. General Joe Ralston, yes, these are in many ways, quote, precision weapons that are being rained on Baghdad. But as you look and listen to the largeness of this attack, and as yet another great dark plume of smoke begins to form a drapery over Baghdad, realistically, what will be the effect on the civilian population of these raids?
Well, I think you're seeing great efforts taken here to minimize the impact on the civilians. For example, you still see the lights on. I'm not saying they're going to stay on forever, but that's one of the things. There's no intent to punish the Iraqi people. Instead, you want to go after the command and control bunkers, those places where Saddam and his leadership could be. And that's what you're seeing, is intense bombardment from, I'm sure, a combination of cruise missiles as well as bombs, satellite-guided bombs, precision-guided bombs, to go after the leadership targets. They're not targeting in any way the Iraqi people.
Without challenging that in any way, let me pass along from an independent journalist witness for Reuters, who says that fires are now raging in an Iraqi residential complex after the missile strikes. My question is that while we talk of surgical strikes, precision strikes, the record shows that there's no way to do it and not have something less than perfection.
Absolutely agree with that. And the U.S. military has never advertised perfection. You're going to have a certain percentage of even the most reliable bombs that we have got that, in fact, are not going to perform the way they're supposed to. You try to keep that to an absolute minimum. And sometimes accidents happen. There's no question about that. It's one of the unfortunate aspects of any war. And that's why we always want to go to war as an absolute last resort.
We go to David Chater from Sky News out of Britain, affiliated with CBS News. David Chater is reporting live in Baghdad. He's reporting to his home base in London. Let's pick it up.
A pall of smoke hanging all around the city at the moment, a lot of fires burning. An extraordinary scene at the moment. Is a bit of a lull, but that's, I think the citizens now of Baghdad know exactly what the Pentagon means by shock and awe. A huge, intense barrage of missiles and bombs aimed at the heart of the city to dislodge, dislocate and paralyze the command and control structures. I'm getting a lot of interference on this radio. It's very difficult to communicate with you. I hope you can still hear me. Can you hear me, Jeremy?
We can still hear you, David, so keep going if you can.
1,000-pounders, I would have thought. Much, much larger explosions than last time. Huge shock waves coming through the balcony and the open doors where I'm standing. I have no idea if you can hear me. Can you still hear me? A very large blast, very close to us.
I can still hear you. I can still hear you, David. Yes, keep talking if you can.
It's impossible for me to hear you, but I can just about hear you in the distance, Jeremy. There's not so much ACAC fire going up now. That huge, intense barrage coming down from the skies or from cruise missiles is impossible for me to say because I don't want to expose myself out there. But it's had the same effect on the ACAC crews and the air defenses. They seem to be suppressed at the moment. Yet another lull, but all the lights of the city. Hello?
Yes, David, keep going. Can you hear me?
I think I've lost my line.
You're still with us, David.
There's a whole shroud of smoke covering all the lamps in the city at the moment. All the traffic is gone. A really intense barrage and series of explosions. Intense percussions and shock waves rolling across the Tigris at the moment. And I think I've lost communication.
David, you're still there. I'll keep talking to try and identify the line. David Chater with us in Baghdad. He says about 30 missiles have landed. And I can tell you from other eyewitnesses that fires are raging in the Iraqi presidential complex after missile strikes.
Well, David Chater has, his line has gone off for the moment. When he comes back on the line and David Chater himself is able to report from Baghdad, we'll pick that back up. The United States has launched the long-awaited, if you want to put it that way, massive aerial campaign against Iraq. Hundreds of bombing runs are planned this afternoon to target sites in Iraq, not just in Baghdad, but elsewhere. This is part of President Bush's current strategy of invoking not only shock and awe, but yes, death and destruction among the very best of Iraqi troops. The idea is to shake them, what's left, whatever is left of the Iraqi leadership, separate them if possible out from Saddam Hussein, whom David Martin reports to the Pentagon. The CIA has now concluded that it was Saddam Hussein on those videotapes, but they're clinging to the idea that maybe those videotapes were pre-recorded. But set that aside for a moment. The purpose of this intense aerial bombardment, by far the most intense of the war, is to convince Iraqi military leaders that it is time, frankly, to run up a white one, to surrender and save their country of more of this kind of punishment. Now, some officials in Washington are calling this the proverbial, quote, A-Day, which is, say, aerial day. The original plan was there would be an A-Day or several A-Days with this kind of bombardment, even more intense bombardment than this. Once again, an ominous cloud rises above the city. There have been tremendous hits on Baghdad here. One doesn't have to be on the ground there to know what an immense attack this has been. What you're hearing now is anti-aircraft fire. That bigger room was clearly a hit of some large weaponry. But this is the so-called, quote, A-Day. But the indications from Washington are that this is a somewhat scaled-back version of what was originally planned as the ultimate on A-Day. Less than 2 hours ago, when we listened to our feed from Baghdad, all we heard, what we heard, were the evening calls to prayer. Then after that, there were air raid sirens. After that, anti-aircraft fire. Then there was a pause, a long pause, more intense anti-aircraft fire. And then this very, very large attack. General Ralston, from what you can see and hear, when one says this was scaled back from the ultimate A-Day kind of attack, is that a fair assessment?
I think it's too early to say, because what we've seen here are a few minutes of a very intense attack. But I can tell you that the U.S. has the capability to do to put this in context. Let's take 1991. We can drop 10 times precision attack munitions in the first 3 days that we dropped in the first 3 days of 1991. These are the satellite-guided bombs that didn't even exist in those days. Let me give you an example. The F-15E fighter that we had in the war in 1991, we only had 18 pods, laser-guided pods, for those airplanes. Tonight, we have got literally hundreds of airplanes with laser-guided bombs.
General, what are the specific targets likely to be? We have one report that fires are raging in an Iraqi presidential complex after missile strikes. Now, these reports come in, the eyewitnesses could be wrong, but let's go down a list of what the most likely targets are. What are they striking at, if you'll pardon that syntax, in Baghdad?
I think one of the things that has to be the very top priority is command and control targets. How do you keep them from passing orders down to their troops to carry out offensive operations? And again, we talked about this as a Soviet model military. Everything has to come from the top on down. Initiative is discouraged. So you want to punish very heavily those Iraqi armed force command and control targets. That includes, in some cases, let me give you an example, ministries. If they are used to direct the actions against our forces, you'd want to take that out. Presidential compounds that you mentioned. Yes, a presidential compound, but how many command and control bunkers and communication sites are in those presidential compounds? That's what our intelligence has to look at, and then provide that intelligence to our targeteers to make sure that we can really concentrate on command and control. The Special Republican Guards, who are, as we say, the most loyal to Saddam Hussein and provide the inner circle protection around him and the elites.
If you will, the elite Republican Guards, the best of the best. The best of the best. Presumed to be the most loyal to him.
Presumed to be the most loyal. That's one of the things that you would really like to come down very, very heavy on, very hard on.
General, we mentioned early in this coverage that there was at least one eyewitness report passed along from Baghdad saying a residential complex was on fire. We've run that back through the system, and I want to report for accuracy that we can't actually confirm that. What we believe we can confirm are fires in the Iraqi presidential complex after missile strikes. That's something quite different from a residential area at large. Right. So our report now, we're adjusting this based on the latest information we have, and under the reporter's creed, you trust your mother, but you check it out. At the early eyewitness report of fires in a strictly residential area, that can't be confirmed. But fires going through the Iraqi presidential complex after several missile strikes can be confirmed. Now, we are not cutting away from this Baghdad picture, where there's been the strongest, longest, and by far biggest air raid on Baghdad of the war thus far, this third one today. We're not going to cut away from it, but our camera up north in the Kirkuk area showed the lights, flares, and then some clumping of a heavy raid on the Kirkuk area. I want to show you on the map here quickly. We won't cut away from Baghdad, but we'll put it in a square up top. Baghdad being in the center of Iraq, and Kirkuk up north in the area where the Kurds and some of the Sunni and, yes, other Shiite Muslims of Iraqi residents are up in that area. But Kirkuk is one of those places that is also being hit. Now, the belief runs strong that Republican Guard positions up there are being hit. We have no way of knowing that for a fact, but we know there are some Republican Guard units up there, and part of what's happening up north in Iraq may be for the purpose of cutting them up and or keeping them from moving. CBS News correspondent Alan Pizzi is there. Alan?
Dan, at about the same time that the bombs started hitting in Baghdad, we had heavy explosions and a tremendous amount of anti-aircraft fire going up from Kirkuk. Kirkuk's about 20 miles from where I'm standing. There's a ridge between us and the actual city, but we've always seen the glow of the oil fires, that are the wells that flare off. Tonight it was much brighter. There were several big explosions on the ground, big booming sounds. A little further down from where I'm standing is the town of Shamshamal. That's the forward position between the Kurds and the Iraqi troops. There was some heavy machine gun fire there. That seems to have died down now. Kirkuk is a problem because American forces obviously want to get in there. They very much want to secure those oil wells, but they're guarded, as you say, by elements of the Republican Guard. The Americans can't get in there at the moment because they can't fly through Turkish airspace. There are still talks going on about that. But we understand that the Kurds, who have said that they will fight the Turks if the Turks come in here, exposing the Americans to a war within a war, the Kurds are now saying they're fairly happy that they have assurances the Turks won't be coming. So perhaps that means that the Americans will be able to get ground troops in here. But tonight, they certainly made their presence felt by pounding the areas around Kirkuk. Kirkuk sits on 10 billion barrels of known oil reserves. The wells extend in an arc about 2/3 of the way around the city, coming from more or less the northeast, heading around, northeast around to the west and down into the southeast. So it's a big area. There's also a very strategic airfield there, which the Americans would obviously like to take over. They take that and they take Mosul, the other major oil-producing area up here, and they can push down to the capital, Saddam's spiritual heartland, if you will, of Tikrit. So it's very important that they get it. The war on the Northern Front seems to have finally started here, Dan.
Alan Pizzi, reporting from the Kirkuk area. Now, north of Kirkuk, let's go to the map if we can here, just in the corner. We're showing you a picture of Baghdad live, and in a moment we're going to replay the worst of the raid on Baghdad thus far. But where Alan Pizzi is, if we can go to the map up here in this corner, we may not be able to go to it. In northern Iraq, this is Kirkuk. That's where Alan Pizzi is. Now, we know there have been big explosions up in Mosul, even more to the north and slightly to the west. This is the rough area of the Kurds. The Turks are extremely interested in getting into this area. The Iranians would like to get into this area because of what Alan Pizzi mentioned. Tremendous oil reserves. There's an oil field up in here, but there are other oil reserves believed in this area. Everybody from the French and the Russians, the Iranians and the Turks would like to get in there and drill it. Two big explosions apparently in the center of Kirkuk, according to Reuters. Another series of big explosions in Baghdad, answering anti-aircraft fire. Kirkuk has about 700,000 people. Baghdad has, or had, between 5 and 6 million people. Despite this assault, by the way, Iraqi radio and television has continued to broadcast, and electric power has remained on, even in buildings very close to these explosions. And that would indicate that the precision the military keeps talking about may indeed be not just talk, but may be real. It also tells you that this is not the ultimate raid that the United States could rain down on Baghdad if it chose to do so, because with the electric power being on, radio and television being on, as the explosions continue, it means that the United States has not dropped the so-called E-bomb. E-bomb for immense microwave, an electrical knockout of Baghdad is widely believed within the capability of U.S. forces. But with radio and television still operating, the lights still on all over the city, it would indicate that no so-called E-bomb has been dropped. Part of Saddam Hussein's old palace compound, old palace because that's the one the British supervised building right after they took over from the Turks in the midst of World War I. The old palace, and where the CBS News interview with Saddam Hussein took place a few weeks ago, the official seat of government is among the targets now confirmed to have been hit. The palace proper appears undamaged, but a building next to it is on fire, and that's where some of that black smoke billowing up is coming from. another 10-story building in another part of the compound. Keep in mind that there along the Tigris River, when you speak of a palace, it isn't just one building. It's acres, a long line of buildings, and an extended palace. So the early indication is that the very heart of the palace proper, the most elaborate part of the palace, appears to be undamaged in this raid. Other buildings in that compound. Some of those thuds in the background would indicate continuing bombing, but most of what you hear is anti-aircraft fire. We're now told in about 5 minutes at the Defense Department, the Pentagon's going to have its own briefing, and there's an indication that they may have some of their own video of this or other raids. So you may want to stay with us for that. We were talking earlier of the so-called E-bomb, which to our knowledge and to every indication has not yet been dropped. An E-bomb, if all went according to plan, would simply turn out the lights all over Baghdad. Computers would melt down, telephones would go silent, anything with a transistor in it would not work if the so-called E-bomb, which developed out of nuclear bomb testing many years ago, had been dropped. So clearly it has not been dropped, at least not over Baghdad. And our belief is it hasn't been dropped anywhere. The Pentagon briefing is just about to begin. David Martin, let me bring you in for a short time. May have to cut you off if the Defense Secretary appears in the room.
And when this week began, we thought the war was going to start with this bombardment at this time. But the war got jump-started on Wednesday night when they got that intelligence that told them where Saddam Hussein was believed to be, and they launched that quick cruise missile and F-117 strike on that bunker, and that sort of started things rolling, and they went right ahead with the ground campaign the next day, even though in the initial planning it was exactly the opposite. We were going to have this shock and awe campaign begin at exactly 1 p.m. on Friday, to be followed on Friday night, Saturday morning in Kuwait, by the start of the ground campaign. So things have been turned exactly upside down, all because of that initial opportunity to get a shot at Saddam Hussein.
As we await the beginning of the Pentagon briefing, it continues to show you live pictures of Baghdad, which Baghdad is still under attack. The major air war has begun against Iraq. Large blasts detonated to the west of Baghdad after air raid irons sounded initially and anti-aircraft guns opened up. There have been airstrikes in the northern city of Mosul. The British Defense Ministry cannot confirm a report that Saddam was likely hurt, if not killed, in the first Baghdad airstrike. U.S. armored columns are advancing toward Baghdad, staying mostly so far west of the Euphrates River, trying to avoid population centers. There has been some resistance from Iraqi troops near Nasiriyah. That's a main crossing over the Euphrates River. And apparently the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, for the moment, has decided to do with Nasiriyah what General Doug MacArthur did with some New Guinea pockets of resistance back in World War II. That is, sort of encircle it and just keep rolling and go beyond it. Doug Chater, we thought we had Doug Chater up, David Chater up. Well, we don't know what this live picture is all of a sudden. This Iraqi man appears out of nowhere on the coverage. But now back to the scene live in Baghdad. David Chater is not available to us at the moment. Let's try to pick him up now. Let's pick him up now.
To be honest, the intensity of the raids, the bombardment there, it's hard to imagine anything is left standing, but only daylight tomorrow will tell us just what has been damaged, how precise, how smart these bombs and missiles really are, and how much the damage has been done to the civilian population as well, who I'm sure have been watching this bombardment.
I'm in an era here that is not David Chater. If you're scrolling along with us, put EA, Era Anchor. It was not David Chater. It was Studio Voice. It's a Sky TV anchorman in Great Britain who's been talking to David Chater in Baghdad. These things happen, and I know you understand it. We're involved with live television. Iraq has vowed to, quote, incinerate the invaders, unquote. Iraq insists Saddam Hussein survived the missile strike. The CIA has confirmed that the pictures shown of allegedly as Saddam Hussein right after the first strike and again after the second strike are indeed pictures of Saddam Hussein. And now the question is whether it was something pre-recorded or not. That situation remains very confused. U.S. troops have seized 2 airfields in western Iraq, and that's partly to make sure, insofar as it can be made certain, that no missiles are fired from western Iraq into Israel. One of the main goals to keep Israel out of this conflict, and so far that goal has been met. British defense source says the main aim of their forces at the moment is to take Basra, the major port, way down south. But the aerial assault center has been on Baghdad and also up north in the Kirkuk area. Explosions around Mosul, far up north. We don't know what has caused the explosions around Mosul. We're being, if you will, conservative about that. Could be air attacks, but could be something else. In Kirkuk, it's another matter. Clearly aerial assault in that area, and believe the targets there, the main targets, Republican Guard. In Baghdad itself, we know parts of the presidential palace, not the main part of the palace, have been hit. It's believed that other command and control centers are among the targets, and elite Republican Guard targets are also part of the attack attempts to encourage Iraqi military leaders separate themselves from Saddam Hussein and give up. How close the U.S. 3rd Infantry tanks and armored columns are to Baghdad is hard to tell just at this moment, but at last report they were still operating west of the Euphrates River, driving to Baghdad in somewhere in the general area of maybe halfway from the Kuwaiti border to Baghdad already. Now, what we're going to do now, while there seems to be a bit of a lull in this live picture of Baghdad, is replay for you what was happening in Baghdad a short while ago. Here are the sights and sounds of a night of horror in the ancient Iraqi capital. We're letting some of this videotape play earlier this afternoon, East Coast U.S. time, of the bombardment of Baghdad, by far the largest bombardment of the 3 days. It was day 1, day 2, this is day 3 of the bombardment. The goals are not to destroy Iraq. The goal is to encourage Iraqi military leaders to recognize the power they're facing and to surrender. We're letting this play. Ooh, what a sight. If you're on the ground in Baghdad or anywhere around it, a sight and the sounds of absolute abject horror. We're awaiting a Pentagon briefing as we let some of this videotape play. Videotape of what happened within the half hour in Baghdad, certainly within the last 45 minutes. The Defense Department is believed to have some video of their own of some of today's air raids keep in mind that perhaps not on this scale, but other air assaults are happening in other parts of Iraq. We know that they've happened around Kirkuk. We believe they may have happened around Mosul. And while civilians are not among the targets, and the U.S. Defense Department keeps emphasizing they're taking every what they consider to be prudent step to avoid civilian casualties. If you are a civilian unconnected to the military or the government in Baghdad, this is, well, to put it as easy as possible, a startling night. Now we're going to listen to David Chater from Sky News, live in Baghdad. He's reporting to his home base in London. Let's pick up David Chater, who's done such a good reporting job from Baghdad live.
I hope I'm sticking by the difficulties imposed on us here, but nothing more than the same restrictions that our correspondents are facing as they drive towards Baghdad at the moment. So Baghdad has been at the center of a firestorm. It's burning fiercely at the moment, but in very specific locations. We don't know yet, because it's very hard to see. The whole place is obscured in smoke. Exactly how extensive the damage is, but it does seem to be limited to, as I say, very focused targets, a fierce assault on certain centers. The air defenses of the city have been responding fiercely themselves, but in the end there's very little they can do to try and prevent the attack.
As David Chater continues to report live from Baghdad, we switch to the U.S. Defense Department at the Pentagon along the banks of the Potomac in Washington, D.C.
Killed in a helicopter accident returning from a mission in Iraq. And in a separate incident, a U.S. Marine was killed in action during combat operations in Iraq. We are certainly grateful for their lives, their courage, and their sacrifice, and our hearts go out to their families. The world will be a safer place because of their dedicated service. On the President's order, coalition forces began the ground war to disarm Iraq and liberate the Iraqi people yesterday. And a few minutes ago, the air war in Iraq began. General Myers will provide some details on the progress of our operation, but first let me comment on the aims and objectives we have for the days ahead. Our goal is to defend the American people and to eliminate Iraq's weapons of mass destruction and to liberate the Iraqi people. Coalition military operations are focused on achieving several specific objectives. To end the regime of Saddam Hussein by striking with force on a scope and scale that makes clear to Iraqis that he and his regime are finished. Next, to identify, isolate, and eventually eliminate Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, their delivery systems, production capabilities, and distribution networks. Third, to search for, capture, drive out terrorists who have found safe harbor in Iraq. Fourth, to collect such intelligence as we can find related to terrorist networks in Iraq and beyond. Fifth, to collect such intelligence as we can find related to the global network of illicit weapons of mass destruction activity. Sixth, to end sanctions and to immediately deliver humanitarian relief, food and medicine to the displaced and to the many needy Iraqi citizens. Seventh, to secure Iraq's oil fields and resources which belong to the Iraqi people and which they will need to develop their country after decades of a neglect by the Iraqi regime. And last, to help the Iraqi people create the conditions for a rapid transition to a representative self-government that is not a threat to its neighbors and is committed to ensuring the territorial integrity of that country. The regime is starting to lose control of their country. Yesterday, the Iraqi information minister declared that the port of Qasr is completely in our hands, quote unquote. Quote, they, the coalition forces, failed to capture it, unquote. In fact, coalition forces did capture it and do control the port of Qasr and also a growing portion of the country of Iraq. The confusion of Iraqi officials is growing. Their ability to see what is happening on the battlefield, to communicate with their forces, and to control their country is slipping away. They're beginning to realize, I suspect, that the regime is history. And as that realization sets in, their behavior is likely to begin to tip and to change. Those close to Saddam Hussein will likely begin searching for a way to save themselves. Those whose obedience is based on fear may well begin to lose their fear of him. Officers and soldiers in the field will increasingly see that their interests lie not in dying for a doomed regime, but in helping the forces of Iraq's liberation. To those in the Iraqi chain of command, some words of advice. Do not obey regime orders to use weapons of mass destruction. Do not obey orders to use innocent civilians as human shields. Do not follow orders to destroy any more of Iraq's oil wells, or to blow up dams, or to flood villages. Those who carry out such orders will be found and will be punished. We are especially grateful for the direct military involvement of the forces of Great Britain and Australia and Poland and so many other countries. And we are deeply grateful for the support of each of the now 45 nations that have publicly associated themselves with the coalition effort in Iraq. We did not choose this war. Saddam Hussein was given a choice by the international community. Give up your weapons of mass murder or lose power. He chose unwisely, and now he will lose both. As in Afghanistan, our objective in Iraq is not conquest or colonization. Iraq belongs to the Iraqi people. Our objective is to bring down a regime that threatens the American people with weapons of mass destruction and create conditions where Iraqis can establish a new government, one that respects the rights of its diverse population and the aspirations of all Iraqis to live in freedom and to choose their own leaders. To American forces and those of our coalition partners, let me say this. Know that we are proud of you, that we stand with you today. We have every confidence in your courage, your tenacity, and your ability to get this job done. All Americans hold you and your families in our thoughts and prayers today. General Myers.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I, too, want to extend my deepest condolences to the families of the Marines, both U.S. and our British allies, who died in the helicopter crash yesterday, and to the family of the Marine killed in action earlier this morning. These brave men died fighting for their nation and the safety of the world. Operation Iraqi Freedom, our effort to disarm Iraq and dismantle the Iraqi regime, is fully underway. But before I go into that, I want to recap what has happened in the last 48 hours and how we got to where we are now. On Wednesday afternoon, we conducted early battlefield preparations by taking out air defense threats, radar, communication sites, and artillery that could pose a threat to coalition forces. Some of these targets included radars in western Iraq and near Basra in southern Iraq, artillery pieces near the Al-Fal and Al-Zabar near Kuwait, and surface-to-surface missiles in the south. Later Wednesday evening, coalition forces began inserting special operations forces throughout western and southern Iraq to conduct reconnaissance operations and take down visual observation posts on the southern Iraqi border. At the same time, as we briefed yesterday, we took advantage of a leadership target of opportunity in Baghdad. Specifically, we struck at one of the residences in southeastern Baghdad where we thought the leadership was congregated. We also struck intelligence service headquarters in Baghdad and a Republican Guard facility. They were targeted with nearly 40 Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles from coalition ships in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. 2 Air Force F-117s also dropped precision-guided 2,000-pound penetration weapons on these leadership targets. Then yesterday, we launched more than 20 TLAMs against 8 targets in Baghdad which included several Baghdad Special Security Organization sites. And as most of you know, the Special Security Organization is that organization that protects the senior Iraqi leadership. Also on Thursday, coalition ships launched some 10 TLAMs against 3 Republican Guard targets in Kirkuk in the north. In the last 24 hours, Special Forces have seized an airfield in western Iraq and have secured border positions in several key locations. Additionally, Navy SEALs and Coalition Special Forces have seized Iraq's 2 major gas and oil terminals in the northern Persian Gulf. There were embedded media with the SEALs, and their reports should be out shortly. I also have a graphic, I think, if they'll bring it up, and it's up now. Good. Coalition ships boarded 3 Iraqi tugboats in the Khor Abdallah waterway and found weapons, uniforms, and mines. Over 130 mines, including influence mines, were discovered. Our naval vessels are being extra vigilant to ensure the Iraqi Navy has not placed any mines in international waters. On the ground, as you know, the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, along with our coalition partners, crossed into Iraq, and they have now secured the port city of Qasr and the Al-Fal Peninsula. They have also secured the main oil manifolds along the Al-Fal waterways and have moved through the southern Iraqi oil fields. These fields, if we're successful, should be secured sometime later today. And they will be a great resource for the Iraqi people as they build a free society. Last night at approximately 10 p.m. Eastern Time, the rest of the ground campaign began in earnest when the 3rd Infantry Division rolled into southern Iraq. There's been a lot of reporting on this, of course, with some of the embedded media. At this hour, our ground forces have pushed close to 100 miles inside Iraq. Since Operation Iraqi Freedom began, coalition aircraft have flown more than 1,000 sorties and dropped scores of precision-guided munitions on Iraqi military targets. I have 2 gun camera shots from yesterday. Both are from F-14s as they dropped on missile targets in southern Iraq. The first is targeting a missile support vehicle. The second is an Iraqi missile storage facility in Basra. And if you note in the bottom of that picture, you'll see another fire that was hit from a previous strike from the same flight. As you've seen from the TV coverage from embedded media, clearly we're moving towards our objectives. But we must not get too comfortable. We're basically on our plan and moving towards Baghdad, but there are still many unknowns out there. We have dropped millions of leaflets over Iraq telling the Iraqi people our intentions and asking the Iraqi military to lay down their arms. In fact, some Iraqi soldiers are surrendering and abandoning their positions in the south and also in the north. Clearly, many Iraqi military are heeding our message that it is better to fight for the future of Iraq than to fight for Saddam Hussein. That brings us up to date. So now within the last hour, coalition forces have launched a massive air campaign throughout Iraq. Several hundred military targets will be hit over the coming hours. But we're getting into future operations here, and I'm going to let those details be briefed by CENTCOM. Finally, I have 2 messages. First, to the commanders and soldiers of the Iraqi forces, I urge you in the strongest possible terms, do the honorable thing, stop fighting, that you may live to enjoy a free Iraq where you and your children can grow and prosper. The second message, to the men and women of our armed forces, and to our allies and our coalition partners, and to all their families, I salute you for your sacrifice, your courage, and your professionalism. Be confident that you are well prepared, well trained, and well supported in the mission that lies ahead. Take pride in the legitimacy and the necessity of your mission. Show compassion for the lives that this war will forever change, but rest assured the outcome is not in doubt. We will disarm the Iraqi regime and ensure their weapons of mass destruction will not fall into the hands of terrorists. With that, we'll take your questions.
Before we do, let me make one comment. Just before coming down, after the air campaign began in earnest about 1 o'clock, I saw some of the images on television, and I heard various commentators expansively comparing what's taking place in Iraq today to some of the more famous bombing campaigns of World War II. There is no comparison. The weapons that are being used today have a degree of precision that no one ever dreamt of in a prior conflict. They didn't exist. And it's not a handful of weapons, it's the overwhelming majority of the weapons that have that precision. The targeting capabilities and the care that goes into targeting to see that the precise targets are struck and that other targets are not struck is as impressive as anything anyone could see. The care that goes into it, the humanity that goes into it, to see that military targets are destroyed, to be sure, but that it's done in a way and in a manner and in a direction and with a weapon that is appropriate to that very particularized target. And I think that the comparison is unfortunate and inaccurate. And I think that will be found to be the case when ground truth is achieved. I would add also that I think we're probably watching something that is somewhat historic. We're having a conflict at a time in our history when we have 24 hours a day television, radio, media, internet, and more people in the world have access to what is taking place. You couple that with the hundreds, literally hundreds of people in the free press, the international press, the press of the United States, from every aspect of the media, who have been offered and accepted an opportunity to join and be connected directly with practically every aspect of this campaign. And what we are seeing is not the war in Iraq. What we're seeing are slices of the war in Iraq. We're seeing that particularized perspective that reporter or that commentator or that television camera happens to be able to see at that moment. And it is not what's taking place. What you see is taking place, to be sure, but it is one slice, and it is the totality of that that is what this war is about and being made up of. And I doubt that in a conflict of this type there's ever been the degree of free press coverage as you are witnessing in this instance. Sir.
Mr. Secretary, it's obvious from the beginning of this major air campaign and from what you all have said that there's been no general agreement by the Iraqi military leadership for a general surrender.
That's for sure.
Could I ask, sir, are there talks, possibly direct talks going on between this building and the Iraqi senior military leadership toward that end, possibly?
In the way you've put it, the answer is no. If you're thinking, is there country-to-country dialogue taking place? And the answer is no. If you're asking, is there contact between coalition forces and Iraqi forces, the answer is most certainly. There has been over the past period of weeks, and those discussions have intensified, but they tend to be particularized to a specific unit in a specific location.
So in terms of any general surrender, they're not, you wouldn't say that there were talks going on at high levels?
I answered that. The answer is no.
Mr. Secretary, do you believe Saddam Hussein is currently in control of Iraq?
I don't know.
Do you have any indication that the leadership has changed hands?
I hear scraps of information, and you can be certain if I had a sufficient number of scraps that it began to make a persuasive case that I would opine on it.
Can you characterize the command and control structure that you believe is in place currently inside Baghdad?
Until there's good solid evidence that it doesn't exist, we have to assume that it is in place and functioning in one way or another. Our hope, our expectation is that they probably had multiple methods of communicating through their command and control system. They had redundant systems. And so to the extent we are successful in eliminating some, our expectation is that even if it's simply couriers, they will have the ability to communicate. I think it's a stretch to think it's possible to eliminate their ability to communicate up and down through their command system. Our hope and our prayer is not that we'll get 100% of their ability to communicate, but rather that we will be persuasive enough with the people who would have to implement the orders of the senior people in that regime and persuade them that it is clearly not in their interest to obey those types of orders.
Can you help us to clarify here, the type of people that you are in contact with represent what? Republican Guard and regular Army outside of Baghdad? Are you in touch with any of those inside, which is where his key levels of support are?
For the most part, it's outside.
And is that
Could you elaborate as much as you possibly can about the fate of Saddam Hussein and what you know so far about the success of the strike on the command headquarters?
There's no question but that the strike on that leadership headquarters was successful. We have photographs of what took place. The question is, what was in there? And until we gather sufficient information and intelligence and have more than one source that gives us conviction, we have to assume that the operation is proceeding.
Do you have one source that might have perhaps seen him coming out?
I don't want to get into that.
Mr. Secretary, if Saddam Hussein and his sons were listening to this briefing and they wanted to give up, what precisely should they do? And is now that the air campaign over Baghdad has begun, is it in fact too late for them to choose to go into exile? Is their only choice to be captured, surrender to the United States, or be killed? Is it too late for exile?
It is certainly too late for them to stay in power. What they do with themselves is up to them, and what the people around them do with them is up to the people around them. But you know, it's I guess time will tell what kinds of judgments they'll make. So far, they've made very poor judgments.
What should you give up? What precisely?
Oh, I don't need to give advice to that. They know precisely what to do.
General, have you, as a course?
You mentioned earlier the allusions to bombing campaigns in World War II, and that's an inappropriate historical analogy.
Those were dumb bombs, and they were spread across large areas.
Finish my point.
These are very precise weapons.
But one thing that characterized those campaigns and the bombing of Hanoi was that the public, their spirit did not diminish. They hunkered down and they pretty much resisted the bombing. What makes you so certain that in this case, even though it's precise, that shock and awe won't just force the Iraqis to hunker down and wait it out, like the Brits, the Germans, the Vietnamese, and the Japanese in World War II and in Vietnam?
Well, for one thing, the people here are a repressed people. Anyone there, I think, while it has to be a terribly unpleasant circumstance, we'll have an opportunity to see the precision with which we're going about this task, and that the targets are military targets, and that this is not an attack on the Iraqi people. It's not an attack on the country of Iraq. It's an attack on that regime that has refused to disarm peacefully. Yes.
Can I just add to that? The Secretary is absolutely right. This is about their military capability, and we have the capability in a reasonably precise way to go after those military targets. They're going to diminish their capability over time. And so we think that, combined with what other things you see going on, I think I mentioned in my remarks, the folks that have entered in southern Iraq, we have folks in western Iraq, we have folks in the north, their sights are set on other objectives. They're not going to stay where they are, so this is a combined issue. We're not counting on just the air piece.
Folks in the west.
You mentioned in your opening statement that you're moving along towards your objective, and some of the IMBIDs are reporting that their units have reached places before they thought they would Is this 100 miles what you expected? Would you say things are going faster than you thought?
I would let the combatant commander characterize that. When I said that, I meant in the general sense of the overall plan. We knew that, I mean, if they had used chemical weapons at this point, that would have affected the timing and so forth. But the thing that you saw Wednesday night with the quick strike on a leadership target, very well coordinated between all elements of this government and all elements of our U.S. Armed Forces on very short notice, is the kind of thing I think you can expect to see as this conflict unfolds. We have much greater flexibility and adaptability today, not as much as we would like, but a lot more than we've ever had in a previous conflict. So whether it goes faster or slower, we'll be able to adapt.
To go back to the last question for a minute, it's important to remember that this attack is against a regime that is responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of people. This is not a benign regime. This is a regime that has killed hundreds of thousands of human beings. Makes a practice of it.
Along those lines, though,
just a second.
Along those lines, though, doesn't it make it more likely there'll be civilian casualties if you're going after hundreds of military targets, even though you have precision weapons? And I think a lot of people would say in this country, and particularly in Baghdad, why not make it more targeted bombing against particular sites as opposed to hundreds of sites?
What is taking place today is as targeted an air campaign as has ever existed.
But it makes it more likely to be civilian casualties, isn't that right? If you're talking
We have analyzed it. Every single target has been analyzed, and the weapon has been carefully selected, and the direction in which the weapon is delivered has been carefully examined, and the time of day when there is the greatest prospect of minimizing any innocent lives. It is an enormously impressive effort, a humane effort, to do what is necessary to reduce this threat against our country and that region, and to eliminate a regime that has killed hundreds of thousands of human beings.
General Myers.
Secretary, why do you think Saddam Hussein has not used chemical or biological weapons, and do you think that the strike Wednesday on the leadership target played any role in that?
Don't know. Yes, Pam?
Myers, you mentioned in your brief summary of the war actions to date what is happening in southern Iraq. Can you tell us what U.S. and coalition forces may be doing in the northern part of the country, and to what extent the Turks may have crossed the border?
Best that I know, the Turkish forces have not crossed the border from Turkey into northern Iraq. And in terms of the operations up there, we haven't said a lot about them, and I'd prefer to leave that either to CENTCOM or just not to talk about them right now.
Just one second. I think it should be added that the Turkish forces go in and out of the northern part of Iraq and have for years, and they may have some forces.
In fact, they have had some forces in northern Iraq for some time, not associated with what's going on right now.
But in terms of any large numbers, they are not.
You've repeatedly emphasized the importance of oil.
Yes.
Thank you.
Secretary, can you characterize the level of resistance coalition forces are feeling, and is there a relationship between resistance and the decision to go ahead with a massive air campaign?
The decision to go ahead with the ground campaign and the air campaign was a direct result of the fact that the 48-hour ultimatum expired and the Saddam Hussein and his crowd did not leave the country. It is after still additional time, in the hope that a large number of senior military people making a conscious decision that they would prefer to act with honor and separate themselves from that regime. When that did not happen, the only choice one has is to proceed and use coercion. It was the absolute last choice after every single other thing that could be done had been done.
So, Mr. Secretary, is a second deadline issued then for the senior Iraqi official to surrender by a certain time?
No, there was no certain time. There was time provided, as you are well aware. The President spoke, I believe, and gave a 48-hour ultimatum on Monday, Eastern Standard Time, 8:14. It came out of his mouth. By Wednesday, 48 hours had expired. Today is, Friday. The ground campaign began last evening, about 10 o'clock, and the air campaign began today about 1 o'clock. We have been issuing through a variety of methods, communications urging the Iraqi military to surrender. And it apparently, what we have done thus far has not been sufficiently persuasive that they would have done that. It may very well be that with the initiation of the ground war last evening and the initiation of the air war this afternoon, that we may find people responding and surrendering.
General Myers, could you say whether there's been any resistance, how much resistance there's been, whether there have been any major engagements, and what the situation is around Basra?
I think if you're in a firefight, it's probably major to you. So we've had the sporadic resistance, and as you know, we had a Marine killed. There may be others that I'm not aware of now, as information lags our timeline, but it's sporadic resistance. There have been tank battles, generally limited, but there have been some fighting.
Secretary, you used the term free Iraqi forces the other day. Aside from any communications that you have, are there indications that some Iraqi units have turned against the pro-Saddam forces, or are there other forces in the north that may be outside the coalition fighting against Saddam?
To my knowledge, you could not answer that question the way you phrased it. Yes, there are forces that have surrendered. There are forces that have had discussions about the possibility of helping. But to my knowledge, there are none that have turned in quite the way you're describing it.
How many have surrendered? Any rough idea?
It's untidy. We get mixed reports from different places, and I wouldn't want to start adding them up. Well, just off the top of my head, I can think of a few hundred.
I think a few hundred, and defections, though, you don't know, but there's lots of reports of defections as well.
A lot of people just leave and melt into the countryside.
General Myers, yes, you and other officials in this government, of course, said before this many times that flatly that Iraq did have biological and chemical weapons. We also heard from several commanders that they were actually convinced that Saddam, in the last resort, would use those weapons. In these 40 to 48 hours, have you learned anything in addition about that capability, about where they might be, and about the readiness of Saddam and his commanders to use them?
And nothing definitive.
Mr. Secretary, Mr. General Myers, Mr. Secretary, could you please...
There have been a variety of views offered on that subject, and a lot of them tend to cluster around the idea that the most serious period would be if the Iraqi regime did not flee and the forces got close to where they likely are in Baghdad or Tikrit, and the closer they got, the greater the danger of that. We don't, that's been more a theory on the part of outsiders rather than a theory on the part of insiders through interrogation or communications.
General Myers, could you elaborate on the mines that were found? Were the Iraqis engaged in an effort to lay those mines down? Was there resistance? Can you tell us anything more about that?
I don't know about the resistance part. I just know, I think I said the number was, over 130, I believe, mines. Some of those influence mines, meaning they're not just contact, they can detect passing ships and so forth. And there were three boats, and they had uniforms on the boats as well. It's one of the things that General Franks has prepared for, was to be looking out for mines in the Gulf. You remember in the Desert Storm, there were mines in the Gulf, and it was a...
Was this in Iraqi waters, or was it...
It was right up there. It was, I had it on the diagram, but it was right up there along the Rocky waters, basically.
General Myers, how is the deadlock with Turkey affecting the campaign over How is the deadlock with Turkey affecting the campaign over actually being able to get the overflight rights that we need?
Well, we've said a couple of times from up here that that we have forces in the north now. General Franks intends to put more forces into the north. It'd be helpful if Turkey would go along and make the arrangements that the Parliament approved, and that is for overflight. So we're still hoping for that, but we're not counting on that. And we have other ways of inserting those forces.
General Myers, it's clear that you're in the process.
And we're in the process of utilizing the other ways.
General Frank, excuse me, are you moving to protect the oil fields around Kirkuk?
They're all
I
right.
just asked that. You said you didn't want to go into detail, but are you moving to protect the oil fields? You all have emphasized the importance of oil.
We've said that the oil is the Iraqis' people's oil. It's a part of the wealth of their country. It would be a crime to destroy those fields. We've had lots of intelligence that suggested that explosives were being moved into those areas and that there was a risk that the Iraqi regime would do what they did to the Kuwaiti oil fields, and that it was an environmental disaster. We, as General Myers said, have control over a non-trivial fraction of the oil wells in the south. And we're fortunate to say that because of the speed with which that was done, there looks to be only about 10 wells that we know of out of possibly 1,000 in that area that have been damaged. Several are still on fire. Several are pouring oil onto the ground. We would intend to, in fairly short order, have the people that know how to repair those wells in there and putting the fires out and fixing the ones that are still spilling on the ground.
Mr. Secretary, could you please for a moment talk about the use of the Predator in this campaign and whether or not you've been able to glean any valuable information from the use of the Predator? Maybe General Myers could comment on that also.
We're using the Predator and it's helpful.
Mr. Secretary, could you please tell me has it been really invaluable in terms of gleaning information that you can use to promote the campaign?
It's an intelligence gathering platform, and we use it along with dozens of other platforms, and they're all helpful.
General Myers.
Charlie's question.
Are you moving to secure the fields in the north, sir, given these fears that they might set them on fire?
That gets into some operational considerations that we just can't get into right now.
General Myers,
On the air campaign, that began after the ground campaign, which was a reversal of the first Gulf War.
That's correct.
Can you talk a little about the conditions that enabled that to happen and what the advantages were of doing it that way? For instance, did the firing in the no-fly zone in the south clear out the opposition needed to pull in those ground forces?
That was a judgment that General Franks made after consultations with the Secretary. There were, of course, certain objectives in the South that were important. One of them we just talked about, the oil fields. If you remember, the fires in the oil fields started before the ground forces went. And so General Franks had to make a calculation on when he wanted to do what he wanted to do. And that's just one of the reasons. There are a couple of other reasons as well. There were some threats, as you know, being moved into southern Iraq, artillery, short-range surface-to-surface missiles, and felt this was the best way to do it.
General Myers.
Follow up on that?
The fact pattern is different. It's a decade plus later. The circumstance of the Iraqi forces are quite different. The capabilities of the United States of America are quite different. I think that expecting that you're going to find a cookie mold fit between two events that are so substantially different and separated in time by such a long period of time and so many advances in technologies and a notably different purpose. The purpose then was to remove them from Kuwait. The purpose now is quite different. Way in the back.
Over here, it seems to me that we're moving relatively freely toward Baghdad. General Myers talked about we're 100 miles inside. There's reports of surrenders, and then with the attack on Wednesday that we degraded Saddam's capability of communicating with his commanders. Yet we keep talking about this overwhelming force that we're prepared to use. I'm wondering, are you concerned at all that we will be seen as a bully?
The United States and the coalition forces have taken every conceivable step, diplomatic, economic, and ultimatum, and a careful, measured beginning. What we are currently doing could not, by any stretch of the imagination, fit what you just said. It would be it would be to misunderstand everything that's taking place.
General Myers, there had been some concern that the Iraqis might try to use controlled floods or even sabotage of its dams or reservoirs to impede an advance from the south. Is there any evidence of that? And what's being done to try and secure those dams and reservoirs?
To my knowledge, there is no evidence to date of that. We have taken some actions to help mitigate that. I'm not going to go into what they are, of course. And I think as we've told you before, well, I'll just leave it there. We're just not going to go into the operation.
Ma'am, last question.
Could you describe the command relationship U.S. maybe special forces have with the Kurdish and the Iraqi opposition forces in the north? Is it positive control, or are they embedded with them and advising them on what to do? And is the United States asking Turkey not to send troops in beyond that refugee buffer zone? And if so, why not? Why?
You get it.
We have special forces and units connected to Kurdish forces in the north, in answer to your question. And you can be certain that we have advised the Turkish government and the Turkish armed forces that it would be notably unhelpful if they went into the north in large numbers.
Isn't that complicating? Isn't that the issue that's complicating the overflight rights? It's that request that the United States has made that's now making Turkey say, well, then you can't fly through our airspace?
There apparently were a lot of issues involved, and that may very well be one of them, but over a period of, 3 or 4 months now that these discussions have been going on, my impression is that the discussions are pretty much towards an end.
And is the fourth ID out of this fight, at least from Turkey in the north?
That's up to Tom Franks, and he'll make judgments about that in good time, and I guess time will tell how many forces will actually be needed on the ground, but there are other ways to bring them in than Turkey.
Have you found any guns? How long will this war last?
The Secretary of Defense, along with the Chairman of the Military Joint Chiefs, ending their briefing. This has been the most intense day of the war with its million horrors, as Shelley once wrote. And among the major developments are the biggest number of airstrikes and the greatest intensity of airstrikes so far started against Iraq about 2.5 hours ago. What you're looking at now is this is Baghdad earlier, when it was hit time and time again. This is by far the most Baghdad has been hit in the 3 times, and it may be hit again later this afternoon. And what you have here is the Council of Ministers building is burning. Yes, Baghdad is burning, but only in specific places. The presidential palace, not the old palace itself, but one of the presidential palaces along the Tigris building there was hit hard. A 8 or 10-story building is believed to be. This Council of Ministers building was hit hard. We'll play some of the tape from Baghdad earlier for those who need their memories refreshed, and for those who haven't seen it before. They're all over Iraq today and all around Iraq. There is smoke in the air, on the land, and the sea. As these airstrikes have been continuing for about 2.5 hours, they include some B-52 strikes and are expected to continue during the afternoon, including, our analysis is, very likely additional hits on Baghdad on the order of these. Large blasts also were detonated to the west of Baghdad, and that's an area in which some of Saddam Hussein's very best troops, the so-called elite Republican Guard, are believed to have been gathered. The oil fields in Ramallah, in the southern part of Iraq, are reported to have been secured. U.S. armored columns, basically of the 3rd Infantry, are racing toward Baghdad. At last report, they were still west of the Euphrates River and trying as best they could to avoid population centers in the main, and so they could keep rolling toward Baghdad. Iraq has vowed to, quote, incinerate invaders. U.S. troops have sealed 2 airfields. They've seized 2 airfields in western Iraq. That's primarily to search for any missile installations out there, and also to try to eliminate any possibility that Saddam Hussein could launch missiles toward Israel, keeping in mind that one mission of the American troops is not to have Israel drawn into the conflict. David Martin is at the Pentagon. David, we've had this series of air attacks. Other air attacks are happening, particularly in the north, that we know around Kirkuk, we think around Mosul. What else is happening? What is the storyline of this hour as you think through this long Defense Department briefing we've just gone through?
Well, I think the storyline is in what General Myers said, which is that hundreds of military targets will be attacked in the coming hours. So that means we've got a long way to go, I think, in this present air campaign, and by no means have seen the last of it, although I am not 100% sure that we're going to see more attacks against Baghdad, but certainly throughout the country we are going to see many, many more attacks. It's important, I think, to remember that the purpose of these attacks is not to blow things up, but to change the regime. And I thought some of what Secretary Rumsfeld said was fairly remarkable on that subject. In my experience, he is an extraordinarily cautious person in predicting anything that requires a judgment and is not just a simple assertion of facts. And he said things like, the regime is starting to lose control, the confusion of the Iraqi officers is growing, their ability to control the country is slipping away. Now those are statements which describe a regime going down the tubes. And for him to make those, given his track record of being so cautious, I take as extraordinarily significant. As one senior official who sees all the intelligence, his assessment of how the regime is weathering these strikes.
David Martin, live from the Pentagon. As you look at a live picture of Baghdad, things quiet there. No one can say for sure whether there will be additional attacks during the day. It's widely expected that there may be. General Myers, the chairman of the Military Joint Chiefs, saying at the Pentagon briefing that there will be, and I believe this is direct quote, hundreds of airstrikes in Iraq today. That doesn't mean over Baghdad itself. But make no mistake, Baghdad has been hit extremely hard in the sense selected targets, and so far as we can determine, and this includes David Chater, the Sky News correspondent who's filing for CBS News in addition, he's several times has said, as best he can make out, that the Pentagon is making, the U.S. Defense Department is making good on its promise to be as precise as possible and to hit specific targets, such as we know that additional targets were hit today on the palace grounds, not the old palace itself, the most elaborate center of the oldest palace in Baghdad, if not the most elaborate and the best. We know that the Council of Ministers building was hit. That's a place where, by the way, some defense planning allegedly and reportedly over months and years has taken place. Those kinds of specific targets, David Chater, our man in Baghdad, the Sky News man there, continues to say it's his best estimate that pretty much making good on that. That yes, there are fires, yes, there's tremendous smoke, but the fires have been, so far as eyewitnesses can attest in Baghdad, have been in specific places, and they are places known to be centers of Saddam Hussein's power. We go to one of our consultants, Joe Ralston. General, your quick assessment of what is being hit in Iraq as a whole, not just in Baghdad, but what's being hit now with these, as General Myers put it, hundreds of airstrikes.
First thing, as he said, you need to take down air defense sites in order that our airplanes can fly there and with impunity is what our objective is. Next, you need to take down radars. Then the command and control to try to keep the leadership from giving coherent orders down to the troops. As we know, as we've talked about the old Soviet style, the troops don't take initiative on their own. They've got to be told what to do by their commanders, and so you want to eliminate those means of doing that.
And these airstrikes can be, and I don't mean to make light of them in any way, if you will, put the Iraqi army on an incentive system, give them an incentive to break away, surrender, and say we're finished with Saddam Hussein.
Absolutely right.
Thanks, General. Let's go to northern Iraq and CBS News correspondent Alan Pizzi. Alan, we know there have been airstrikes in your area. What do you know about them, and have you any information on the continuing reports, so far as I know, unconfirmed, of some U.S. Army airborne activity in northern Iraq?
And what we saw a few hours when the raid started on Baghdad, in fact, was behind me. The glow that you see behind me is the glow of oil wells and the lights of the city of Kirkuk. That was lit up with anti-aircraft fire at about the same time Baghdad was lit. There were several large explosions on the ground, and as we heard just in the briefing from the Department of Defense, that was cruise missile strikes and others. What the anti-aircraft gunners were firing at, we don't know, because we did not hear any aircraft at all. But Kirkuk is a place that they're going to want to soften up, because as you also heard at the briefing, there's still a problem with getting U.S. forces into northern Iraq to open up this northern front. Now, we understand from reports coming out of Turkey that the discussions are still going on. One of our contacts in Turkey says he believes there will be a breakthrough tonight, that the U.S. will be able to make use of Turkish airspace. The problem is that the Turks are asking that they be allowed to bring their forces into northern Iraq. And that's something that the Kurds, who are staunch allies of the U.S., simply will not tolerate. They don't want to know anything about it. They say they will fight the Turks if they come in, which gives the Americans a war within a war, not something they need. Now, one of the things you have to bear in mind about Kirkuk is that it is now about half to two-thirds an Arab city. The other half is Kurdish, but it used to be almost entirely Kurd. The Arabs that are in there at the expense of Kurds. These are people who were moved in after the Kurds were moved out by Saddam Hussein's forces, a kind of gradual ethnic cleansing of the city, if you will. So it's reasonable to assume that the forces guarding that city, some of whom are Republican Guard, would be wanting to guard that. And I think that you can't assume that they're going to give up. Secretary Rumsfeld made a very nice speech about how the Iraqi soldiers should all give up. I doubt that anybody in the bunkers behind me is listening, so there could be a fight for Kirkuk, Dan.
CBS News correspondent Alan Pizzi in northern Iraq around Kirkuk, Dateline, Tehran, Iran. The Iranians say a rocket has hit an oil refinery depot in southwestern Iran, close to the border with Iraq, and 2 people have been killed. Let's take you to our map and show you the rough area where Iran, we're here, has a long border with Iraq. And the place roughly where the Iranians say a rocket is slammed into an oil refinery depot is in this area. Mark well, we don't know who fired that rocket. It would be inaccurate and in fact unfair to make any assumptions about who fired the rocket, and indeed this is according only to Iranian sources. Keep in mind that Iran, already a big player, a very big player in the Middle East, with the regime of Saddam Hussein, when it is eliminated, Iran will be in many ways the big player around the Persian Gulf, setting aside, of course, the United States and its allies. We want to show you some videotape. For the 3rd day in a row, the Iraqis have put out some videotape indicating that Saddam Hussein is not only alive, but he's well, and he's directing his various forces. Now, this is from Iraqi TV, put out today. Whether this was pre-recorded or not, as we've said in previous instances where what is believed to be Saddam Hussein appears on television, the United States government now says they do believe the man appearing in these Iraqi television videotapes is indeed Saddam Hussein. That's fact one. The U.S. government has made that analysis. What we don't know is whether this was canned in advance, pre-taped material. We have no empirical evidence that it is, and no credible witness testimony that it is, but there is that possibility. Now, it is also true that the Washington Post has run pretty hard with the story based on high intelligence sources and others in the administration, that they continue to insist that they believe Saddam Hussein and his sons were in that bunker that was hit the other day. And by the way, the videotape today not only had Saddam Hussein, but had his oldest son also in the picture, which if you take it at face value, means that not only Saddam Hussein, but his oldest son also survived the bombing the other day, but that's if you take it at face value. Now, Byron, Byron Pitts is with a U.S. Marine chopper unit at its base in Kuwait. We're going to go to Byron Pitts as we wait for a White House briefing. We'll go to the White House briefing as soon as it occurs. In the meantime, Byron, tell us what you know.
Well, Dan, at the moment you're looking at a live picture of a British fighter plane that's also on this U.S. airbase not far from the Iraqi border. We've seen British tornadoes taking off throughout the night. As you pan back towards me, you're passing by a workstation where U.S. Marines are working on Huey helicopters. Dan, the scene at this moment, for security reasons, we're not allowed to discuss the operation that's going on right now, except to say that U.S. Marine helicopter pilots are engaging the Iraqi military at this hour. At this airbase.
Excuse me, Byron, we're going to switch away and go to Ari Fleischer at the White House.
You in on the President's Day. The President this morning, in his remarks with congressional leaders, noted the sacrifice that the brave men and women of our military are making. Particularly, the President extends his sympathy and condolences to the families of those who lost their lives, the Americans and the British, in events in the Persian Gulf. The President also honors the sacrifice of all the family members who are at home as their sons and daughters, husbands and wives are in the Persian Gulf, fighting for the disarmament of the Iraqi regime. The President this morning had his intelligence briefing, followed by a FBI briefing. He convened a meeting of the National Security Council. Then he had a meeting with the Secretary of Defense. The President this morning, also as part of the consultation with members of Congress, met with the Speaker
we're
of the
cutting away
House,
from
the
Ari
Majority
Fleischer and
Leader,
taking you back to Baghdad,
Leader
where
Pelosi.
there are indications Baghdad is again under attack. We go live to Baghdad. That's anti-aircraft fire. But as you know, the sequence of events is frequently you hear anti-aircraft fire because, in the past has been the case, the air raid sirens in the far distance, because the Iraqis have their radar installations, they have their ways of determining what they believe to be an incoming air attack. So we're going to hold with this for a minute. This is happening against a background of earlier attacks on Baghdad today were the heaviest of the war, with the U.S. Defense Department continuing to emphasize that those attacks are at specific targets having to do with Saddam Hussein, his command and control, his regime. They are not directed at the Iraqi population, and they are not directed at infrastructure per se, which is to say, more heavy anti-aircraft fire. That thump-thump in the distance indicates incoming cruise missiles and/or laser-guided bombs. Left-hand corner of your screen, something out there in the distance was hit. The light bouncing off the smoke. Yet another column of smoke rising. What we're showing you now are 4 different camera positions around Iraq, around Baghdad. Upper left-hand screen, the most vivid demonstration of what has been hit in these last few seconds, as Baghdad once again becomes a scene of blood and iron. We're listening for additional hits. There's no way of knowing whether this quick burst of hits in Baghdad, remember we're showing you Baghdad live, 4 camera positions. We do not know specifically what has been hit yet. We do not know specifically what weapons have been used. The belief is that these were probably cruise missiles of one kind or another, but clearly labeled that a guess. Well, Baghdad has been hit again for the second time today. So far this time not nearly as heavily as it was hit earlier. What we're going to do is we're going to keep a picture of Baghdad alive up in part of your screen and then go back to the White House briefing with R.A. Fleischer in the hopes that he'll have something substantive to say about what the president's been doing and what's happening on the ground in Iraq.
Campbell. The president may occasionally turn on the TV, but that's not how he gets his news or his information.
It is, but we just want to try to get it in.
From time to time, he might.
Can I ask on a different subject? There was a humanitarian crisis in Iraq even before the bombing began, in terms of food shortages. After what we saw today, this massive attack on Baghdad, that situation is clearly going to be much, much worse beginning tomorrow. What specifically is the administration planning to do when the sun comes up?
Well, one, that's not necessarily true. The destruction of a palace of Saddam Hussein's or the destruction of a military facility may not have anything to do with the feeding of the Iraqi people. In all cases, the United States is leading the effort, and along with the military come of everything that may be necessary to help protect and to feed the Iraqi people. We will see if any of that is indeed necessary to the degree that has been anticipated and planned for. But you should not necessarily leap to that conclusion based on what you saw on TV today.
Just one final question. President Chirac of France said today that he would not support a UN resolution that would give the U.S. and Britain the authority to administer it in Iraq. What's your reaction?
Well, as was said at the statement in the Azores, we will continue to work with the United Nations. The President does believe the United Nations has a role in the future of Iraq and the reconstruction of Iraq. The President would hope that nobody would stand in the way of the humanitarian reconstruction of Iraq. Mark?
We're going to go back to Baghdad Live now. As scenes of the damage are difficult to make out, it is just before 10 p.m. at night in Baghdad. But in this most recent hit, we'll get up one of the different camera angles. We hear in the distance the sounds of some ambulances. And as you saw before, if we can get up the other shot, which we may be able to do in a minute there, so much smoke rising. General Joe Ralston, who's here with us, makes the point with all of this smoke over Baghdad, and there's been a lot of smoke, particularly the last two raids, yesterday's raid and then this, let me describe, tremendous raid today. One difference between the attacks of 1991 and the attacks now are laser, check me as we go, laser-guided bombs have trouble getting through this smoke, correct? But now the U.S. military has GPS, which is to say satellite-guided bombs that have no difficulty getting through this smoke. They can get right on target.
That's correct. And that was one of the reasons that we developed the satellite-guided bomb.
One of the reasons we developed a satellite-guided bomb is to get through this kind of smoke.
Get through smoke and weather.
And the assumption is it's much more accurate under these conditions than would be what we now call the old-fashioned laser-guided bomb.
Absolutely, because the laser-guided bomb under these conditions would turn into an old dumb bomb, if you will.
Now, as we look at Baghdad again burning, one is reminded that no matter how surgical the hits are designed to be, no matter how precise the weapons, and as General Ralston has just made clear, they're much more precise now. That's not hyperbole, it's not spin, it's a fact that the air bombardment weapons are much more capable of much greater precision now than they were before, that no one can rule out the possibility that some bomb goes astray. Up to and including now, there's been no report from the Iraqis or from anybody else, from the independent reporters, including David Chater, the Sky News man who's filing for CBS News. Nobody has claimed that any of the weaponry has gone astray. Now, in the wake of this very heavy bombardment today, we'll see whether that holds. Now, Dateline Turkey, the confusing Turkey situation gets even more confusing. You will recall that yesterday it was, we thought, and everybody else thought, reliably reported that the Turks had agreed to allow the overflights of their country. Now, Dateline Ankara, Turkey, has not yet opened its airspace to U.S. military overflights, and the Turkish authorities say that they're continuing to talk with Washington. So yesterday agreement was reached. Today they still haven't opened the airspace, and one could make of that what one will. General Ralston, what happens in bombing lulls? Is this part of the plan this time? We had the tremendous hits, what, about beginning maybe 2 hours ago. Then we had a pause. I won't call it a lull, because if you're on the ground in Baghdad, you would hardly call it a lull. You might call it a pause. And then another set of hits. What's the thinking?
Well, I think there are two things at play here. If you're trying to put intense pressure on the leadership, then you want to keep them off guard for a long time. You hit them. Just about the time they recover, you hit them again. They recover, you hit them again. That's one factor of why you would like a prolonged series of raids. Another factor is this is a very complex thing. You only saw the cruise missiles and the bombs going off, but think of all the hundreds of airplanes and hundreds of people you have to have behind that, in terms of the tankers, in terms of the AWACS aircraft, in terms of the jamming airplanes. And those airplanes need to take a break and go back and hit the tanker and refuel and come back again. So this is a long term. You want to make sure you can do this for a long time, and you have to pace yourself as you do it.
So we should not rule out yet an additional strike or strikes on Baghdad. Not saying it's going to happen, but we wouldn't rule it out, because there's still a lot of nighttime darkness left over Baghdad.
Absolutely right. I have no idea whether there will or won't be, but it's certainly a reasonable thing to expect that there would be additional strikes against Baghdad.
Let's go to Byron Pitts, who is at an air base in Kuwait. It can get a bit confusing because Byron, in some ways, well, let's just say it's where Cobra choppers of the U.S. Marines are based, and they are returning from a mission. Byron?
Yes, Dan, you're absolutely right. What you're looking at now is a live picture of a Huey helicopter. The Huey returned to base here with 2 Cobra helicopters. The Cobras are attack helicopters, Dan, as you know, used in close air support of Marines on the ground. They can operate anywhere from 50 feet off the ground to 300 yards. Typically, the Huey is a command and control helicopter where the CO, the commanding officer, might stay to monitor what's going on. These 3 helicopters are just returning. They flew in from the north. We know that they've been engaged in missions all day, engaging the Iraqi military, as the military likes to put it, putting steel on target. These are the first choppers to return. Typically, they go out for about anywhere from 10 to 14 hours. Now, these Cobras only operate for about 2 hours in the air, and they go to what are called FARPs, forward air refueling points. Now, because this operation has been the planning, Dan, for close to 18 months, we've been told, the Marines have determined a number of sites. We know the exact number, but we can't share that for security reasons. A number of sites in Iraq, from the border with Kuwait all the way up to the outskirts of Baghdad, where they've set up these FARPs, where the Marines go in, the Cobras and Hueys go in, perform their missions in about 2 hours. They land at these FARPs in the middle of the desert, where the pilots are able to refuel their helicopters and also rearm the helicopters. The primary weapons of choice by the Cobras in this fight are the Hellfire missile system, used to take out Iraqi tanks, the TOW missile system, which they use on smaller vehicles. As for the Huey, that support helicopter, it's, Dan, as you know, it first got its service during the Vietnam War. It's the old workhorse of the Marine Corps. It's equipped with a machine gun, a Gatling gun type machine gun that can fire 4,000 rounds a minute. That's typically used to suppress ground forces, individual soldiers on the ground. They call them, these 3 have just returned. We would expect more to be coming in as the hours pass. Dan?
Byron Pitts reporting live from a U.S. Marine helicopter base along the Kuwait-Iraq border, and those helicopters are obviously flying into Iraq and looking for targets in there. Now, retired U.S. Army General Buck Kernan is with us here. We haven't talked about the ground war much recently. I want to go to the map. Help me and help our viewers out here a bit. If I may, General, if you put that earpiece in, we're going to need it, I think. Thank you. On the map, we go to the map, at least a 3-prong attack came out of Kuwait 36 to 48 hours ago. U.S. Marines and British ground forces were among those headed toward Basra. They've taken a very small port down here, Basra being the main port. Question, why haven't they taken Basra already? We don't know the answer to that. But the main focus right now is the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, which has been going up roughly in this direction. Now, the population center, it's not a big city, but El Nasiriyah is roughly in this area. Remember, the Tigris River is over here, the Euphrates River is here. Around El Nasiriyah is where some large-scale, fairly large-scale surrenders of Iraqi forces were expected. There have been some as the 3rd Infantry went up this way, but actual count we do not have. Now, there is a report, unconfirmed, but we have some reason to believe it's true, that a U.S. Special Forces unit has laid down a special crossing bridge across the Euphrates. Keep in mind, there are regular bridges there, which have not been blown so far as we know, and that if General William Wallace, who commands the ground forces in Iraq, chooses to go across the regular bridges, he can still do that, but also the Special Forces are believed to put down a bridge to cross over the Euphrates. But at last report, the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division General was still west of the Euphrates and was at least 1/3 of the way to Baghdad itself. Now, hold on just a minute, General. I was going to come to you, but we're going to go back live to Baghdad because more anti-aircraft fire has opened up, and it could be a prelude to another strike. Let's watch and listen for a moment. There in the distance is clearly another hit. I don't know in what direction the camera is pointed at the moment. This is the 3rd distinct wave of bombings that has hit Baghdad thus far. General Ralston? Sorry. We're just holding on here to see in the distance there. You saw that flash of light? That would indicate probably somewhere near the outskirts of Baghdad. No way of knowing what's being hit at this moment. But keep in mind, anti-aircraft fire, but I think mixed in with another thump or two. Keep in mind that some of the elite Republican Guard forces are... Oh, that was big. Some of the elite Republican Guard forces are on the outskirts of Baghdad. Others, according to David Chater, the Sky reporter who's also filing for CBS News, has said have already infiltrated into Baghdad itself in private homes. Belief is they may be in some of the mosques. This is, as I say, number 3 in terms of waves of attacks on Baghdad today. By far the largest and most destructive began about 2.5, 3 hours ago. Then there was a pause, another series of hits, much shorter duration, fewer bombs and missiles, and now this is the 3rd time, which comes after another pause. As you can see in the left-hand half of the screen, just about in the middle, on the left-hand side, burning in the distance what appears to be the major target this time.
A lot of lead up into the air. They're putting a lot of air bursts.
David Chater from Sky News is talking to his home office in Britain, also filing for CBS. Let's pick him up in progress.
They're striking anything, whether they've got any radars left, or I don't know what's happening, and I can't tell you exactly the state of readiness here of the air defenses. But that was the first time I heard the low-level swoop of jets. I heard the roar of engines 3 times. They were low, but I couldn't actually spot them myself, but their target was directly in front of me, and a huge column of smoke going up at the moment. A lot of ambulances going around, a lot of ambulances on the street at the time this attack came through. There's no warning, of course. We had the air raid siren, I don't know how long ago now. But the attacks are continuing across the city. Bombs are falling for the first time. I've heard those jets. I haven't seen them, but I've heard those jets. They were low.
just a bit more coming from the RAF. They've also said that every effort is being made to avoid civilian casualties and also damage to civilian infrastructure, and all the weapons they've been using are precision guided. Would that tally, David, with what you're witnessing?
I couldn't possibly say. I mean, it's very hard for me to say what targets they're going for, and I'm not going to say what targets they're going for. But trying to avoid civilian casualties in these conditions, I would say, is impossible. There are a lot of ambulances around. The hospitals are filling with casualties. Tomorrow morning, when this long night of attacks is over, I'll be able to give you a much more accurate picture. It's impossible for the RAF or the Pentagon to say what's happening, but here on the ground, I would say yes, there are a lot of casualties, no matter how surgical they think these strikes are, in such a densely populated urban environment. As I saw this morning in the hospitals myself, there are a lot of children, men, women and children who have been caught in the shrapnel, caught with the glass blowing in their apartments. In a city this large, not everybody is always in a bunker or taking shelter. There's always somebody, children playing games or going out shopping. It's inevitable that a strike of this intensity is going to cause a lot of casualties, and I've never seen anything like this. I mean, it's extraordinary, the scenes right in front of me at the moment after those low-level swoops by jets, Allied jets, now you have confirmed, British jets probably, but 3 bombs exactly in front of me, exactly in the same place. No idea what it is, but ambulances were operating in that area as they came in. There was no warning at all, just heard the whoosh of the jet engines, and then the strike of the bombs. 3 bombs in a row on exactly the same location.
David, it's Tim Marshall here. Tell me, do the Baghdad population, do the people have sufficient air raid shelters?
They have a huge number of, Tim, as you know, you've been here too, a huge number of public air raid shelters, but there's been an intense feeling here since the last Gulf War, 1991, that after the Al Amaria incident, where there were over 400 casualties in a public shelter, most of the people here fear to go into those because of what happened. 2 missile strikes into the shelter, and there were 400 dead as a result of that. So that is very much in their minds here at the moment. Most of the families I speak to shrug their shoulders and say, you know, they've got loads of children, 10 children, but they're not going into the bomb shelters. They're going into their homes. They're bunkering down. They've got some sort of bunkers from the Iran-Iraq war, most of them actually, so they just rehabilitated those and are sheltering under those at night. Completely inadequate, of course, for the sort of ordnance that's being dropped on this city at the moment. The shrapnel, the hot metal, the explosions, the shattering glass. If they're caught in the open when this is going on, of course there are casualties, but terrifying for them tonight. As this attack continues, no all clear is sounded. I suspect we will not hear an all clear. The air raid siren went off once, and the Akak fire and explosions were already happening. So the air defenses were caught by surprise. We just don't know what's happening, when it's going to happen, but a lot of fires burning, a lot of ambulances moving about in front of me.
And David, have many, if you're allowed to say this, have many people left the city in advance of this?
Sorry, Tim, you'll have to say that again. How many people?
I beg your pardon. If you're allowed to comment on this, if you feel it's okay, have many people left the city in the last few days?
No, it's been impossible for them. Most of them have decided to stay with their families, to stay with their relatives, to stay with their children. Where will they go? Who's going to look after them if they do leave the city? This is their home. This is where their family is. This is where the children went to school. They're trying to get on with their lives as best as they can, but under appalling conditions. And tonight, they're tasting exactly what the Pentagon have called shock and awe. But they're not doing it in large public shelters. They're doing it